And welcome back to the Shock Absorber podcast. It is awesome to have you along with us, and we're going to continue our discussion or mini-series on ministry teams, and in particular the practice of ministry teams through the lens of Soul Revival's Theology-Strategy-Practice. Before we do that though, I must welcome our regular co-hosts, Tim and Stu. Welcome. Are you well?
Yes.
Yes, that's good.
Very well. Thank you, Joel.
Very well. Thank you. That is the most awkward part of the podcast that we do, isn't it?
It is very.
I feel like I need to introduce you, but...
Yeah. You stopped commenting on our clothes, though.
It's been
a while.
I've been doing plenty of work on myself to not do that.
Also, to drag that up again.
Yeah, it's
throw you back.
Oh, you're making me relapse.
Yeah.
So before we get into talking about ministry teams, though, is that we... talking about different types of public ministry to a certain degree just before we got on press record on the podcast, one of which has set the Christian YouTube space alight, which is Wes Huff's episode on Joe Rogan, a 3-hour episode. Tim, I think you've listened to the whole thing. Is that right?
Did. It's my very first Joe Rogan experience.
Well, there you go.
Yeah.
It's kind of like
all day, all night.
All day. It feels like
revealed.
sometimes.
Isn't that what he says at the beginning? All day, all night.
What is it? Train all day, podcast all night, all day.
All night. Yeah,
something like that.
Sounds like that Beatles song, 8 days a week.
Oh, yeah. Initial impressions. There's been a lot of reaction.
There have been a lot of reactions, yes. No, I came across it because Christian Twitter were all over it. I'm like, see what's going on in the Christian Twitter sphere or exosphere. I don't know what you call it now. So, listen to it. And
exosphere.
Well, I know, because cool. X instead of Twitter. So.
I like that. I haven't heard that before.
Yeah.
But you did make that up?
I may have made it up. I don't know if I've heard it somewhere else.
I don't think I've heard that.
I feel like you need to spell it, though, EXO sphere.
Well, no, it's just X.
I know, I understand that. But then if you put in exosphere, then you
got like exoskeleton.
But you also know how they put like X and then a TIN for Christian? I feel like you could put it as a capital X as well.
Oh, I see.
Never thought of that before either.
Yeah.
I always thought it's kind of similar to Generation X.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's true. So you must enjoy always tapping on that icon.
Is that why Elon calls all of his stuff X? Because he's a Gen Xer?
Don't think so. Apparently he just likes the letter. Yeah. Didn't he call a kid X?
Oh, no, his kid's got some weird name with unpronounceable.
Yeah, I thought he called his kid X, came on stage with him or something. Anyway.
I'm looking up Elon Musk's kids' names while you give us your rundown of Wes Huff's episode.
Yes.
So a Canadian apologist.
Canadian, yeah. I mean, he's a PhD student. Like he's yet to be awarded his PhD, but he's been doing that in ancient documents, Christian documents, New Testament manuscripts, those kinds of bits and pieces. One of the things he talks about on Rogan is his specialty is to find these little fragments of papyrus and basically draw out what the whole piece would have looked like based on that little thing. That's one of the things he does, which I find fascinating. And he got onto Rogan because of an earlier podcast he did with another guy whose name I keep forgetting. Who was the atheist that he debated?
Billy Carson.
Billy Carson, there we go. Another name I'd never heard of until this moment. But he had gone on a podcast with Billy Carson and sort of debunked a whole lot of things that Billy Carson sort of has made his trademark attacks on Christianity, and Wes Huff comes in and just goes, actually what you're talking about is not really actually correct, and he sort of breaks down a lot of Billy Carson's ideas. And that kind of got a bit of reaction. There was a bit of a furor around that because Billy tried to get that show cancelled and went to a great degree to try and get that show never to air, which sort of had the opposite effect. The thing became really exciting for everyone to go, what is this thing that Billy Carson doesn't want shown? This is really fascinating. So that kind of got a whole lot of thing. That is what ended up on Rogan. And what I found really interesting is the conversation, the way in which Rogan sort of was really curious. Like he just seemed genuinely interested in the ideas.
So many times.
I saw a meme of that.
There's a supercut.
Yeah, there's a supercut of all these wows.
Wow.
Yep. That's right. And so, I just thought that was really interesting that how interested Rogan is on those kind of things, how well Wes was able to communicate quite complex ideas and his speciality. I like the way that he also a number of times said, well, this is not my speciality, but I'll just let you know a little bit of what I do know. I thought he showed a bit of humility in certain areas. Rogan would sort of question him in a few things, and if it wasn't his area of speciality, he'd just say so straight out. I thought that was really a great way of communicating what he is a specialist in and not trying to speak outside of his area of expertise, which I thought was really interesting. And then sort of it exploded even more so after that because all of a sudden there's this, very conservative Christian, resurrection believing apologist on Joe Rogan talking about all these kinds of things. And the follow-up conversations have been really interesting back and forth on that as well.
Yes, there's been a lot of reaction videos that I've seen. There's one in particular, a reasonably big atheist is Alex O'Connor, who was talking about, one of the things that really stood out to me was they were talking about the book of Isaiah, and they said that the last version we found prior to the Dead Sea Scrolls was from the Middle Ages, and when they found the version of the Dead Sea Scrolls, Wes said it was basically word for word perfect. Wow, said Joe. And then there's been a lot of reaction to that, saying that's incorrect and that's not correct. Alex went really hard in saying there's over 2,000 plus differences to that. I actually don't know the truth, the difference between the two. But there's been like a reaction video to that, and then Wes reacted to that. Wes has also done a video saying, these are the mistakes I made in Rogan's episode. As you said, it's a 3-hour conversation. Yeah. You might get a few things wrong.
I just think a lot of those things that he pulled himself up on were either minor things or things that would come out in a conversation. Like he wasn't doing an academic lecture. He was having a long form conversation, and so there are sort of generalities that come out there. And even that, word for word, even that was, it was a bit of hyperbole, but it wasn't incorrect in terms of, it's virtually identical. Like the staggeringly identical, the medieval manuscript and the ancient manuscript. So much so that it's, you can see, wow, isn't this interesting? Wow, that those who have transcribed it, or for those 1,000 years in between that we don't actually have those copies of, were able to keep it. Now, Wes also said that it is a case for one scroll of Isaiah. There are other things in there as well. Like there's, I remember studying Jeremiah in Bible college. There's a really interesting version of Jeremiah in the Dead Sea Scrolls, which is radically different to the Jeremiah that we have in our Bibles. Like it's missing whole sections. And so that when we studied Jeremiah in Bible college, that was one of the conversations was, okay, what's going on here with this? And I don't actually remember much more of the discussion. But so Wes was quite careful in some parts, but I think some of the other things that he sort of misspoke or just, he used conversational language. And I think Alex O'Connor, who I appreciate a number of his comments and conversations and interviews, but I think he was kind of picking out tiny little specks of inconsistencies in what actually was quite a robust conversation. So, yeah.
I mean, it kind of makes me think it's good that these conversations are really happening to a degree. Like I think, Stu, you were saying you hadn't listened to the full episode, but we said a number of times before how influential Joe Rogan's podcast is on culture, and even talking about the effect it had on the US election. I was just going to ask you, Stu, do you think it's cool that, a Christian apologist is going on one of the biggest podcasts or media platforms in the world, and actually, a number of times I think he was actually preaching the gospel. So I thought that was cool. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, earlier we've talked about Andy Crouch, who says the different responses to culture can be either you oppose it, you just embrace it, or you copy it, or you critique it, or you create culture. I think they were the ones he said. So, yeah, Andy Crouch argued that critiquing culture doesn't really change culture. But I must say I've been thinking lots about that recently, thinking maybe it does. Like if, you got these long-form podcasts, which probably went around when Andy Crouch wrote his book, maybe that's a new entree into this space that actually gets people thinking more. And it's really interesting that such a long conversation can draw so many clicks. They're clever the way they do it too, because they just sort of packaged it up as this is intriguing, that all this information is there. I think to his credit, Rogan seems to be fairly humble in that he's willing to change his mind on things. And, with the election podcast he did with Trump, he was just as happy to have Kamala Harris on as he was Donald Trump, and he was happy to have Walsh on as well as JD Vance. So he's kind of like doing this conversational thing, saying, I just want to get to know people. And I think he's genuine in that. I think, and he's genuinely wanting to hear what Wes was on about and what he thinks about things. I think it's interesting because he's like, at 1 minute, he's sort of interviewing people about, the idea of Atlantis, and the next minute he's talking to a Christian about documentary evidence of the Bible. In the past, he's been quite scathing about the Bible and hasn't had much time for it. But he seems to be moving in his opinion. And I think there's an again, I haven't put much store in celebrities becoming Christians in the past. I mean, recently the whole Kanye West thing with, everyone was all excited about him making Christian albums, and then that seemed to go south. But going right back, I remember when Bob Dylan became a Christian, and by all accounts, apparently Larry Norman helped Bob to think about Christianity. So it's kind of like a 70s version of Joe Rogan podcast. And anyway, Bob Dylan wrote 2 albums that were Christian albums. One was called Slow Train Coming. Can't remember what the other one was.
Saved?
Might have been. Yeah, Saved. Yeah. They didn't do real well. And all of a sudden, Bob Dylan, who was like a mouthpiece for the baby boomer generation, just everyone stopped listening to him. And I remember something Larry Norman said in a concert in the 80s. He said, if people don't listen to Bob Dylan, they're not going to listen to you and me, just because we play, we cross over. There was this big debate in Christian music about, should Christians play Christian music or should they just play secular music? And in the end, the latter won out in the late 90s, where I think a lot of Christian bands, people started saying, I'm a Christian in a band rather than a Christian band. Do you remember those kind of statements? And to be honest, much of Christian music these days seems to be Christian worship music rather than actual Christian albums being put out that are
boring, really. Personally, that's what.
Well, it's interesting.
It's not as exciting for me.
I like Christians being part of subcultural expressions as well. It got a lot of flack, but anyway, there was this big argument back in the 80s between people because Amy Grant, who was a big Christian artist, had crossed over, and she, what was the song? Something baby actually, it could have been called. And there were people saying, oh, this is the way to reach the world, if we could just write secular songs and if we can just convert, top artists to become Christians, then the church would, if we can get a celebrity to become a Christian, everyone will listen. And I remember Larry Norman saying, if they didn't listen to Bob Dylan, why are they going to listen to Amy Grant or listen to you? That's what he was saying at a particular, I think the conference was like a Christian music conference. It wasn't just a general concert. Anyway, so I've got to say that's in the back of my mind as all this stuff comes out. So people are talking about Jordan Peterson, is he going to become a Christian? And, Joe Rogan and others.
Justin Bieber,
yeah, there's another example. And I've got in the back of my mind, if they're not going to listen to Bob Dylan, why are they going to listen to Joe Rogan? Like if he stops being an atheist, they'll probably move on to someone else. But what's really interesting is I don't know if that is still a relevant statement for today. I think maybe there seems to be a shift, I think, in culture generally, where there's a whole heap of little factors all starting to build up in my mind that seem to be pointing towards not necessarily the West moving back to Christianity, but there's a growing conservatism and a growing interest in Christianity. You've got, you guys were talking about the Rest is History podcast. I mean, Dominic, I think, is the presenter on that podcast that wrote Dominion.
Tom Holland.
Tom Holland, I'm sorry. Yeah, Tom. Tom wrote Dominion, which is an articulate apology or apologetic work for Christianity and the influence it's had in the West in a positive manner, almost a reaction against the new atheists from the 2000s that were piling onto Christianity with all this negativity. And it's almost like they got so confident in their negativity that they've gone a bit too far and they're saying things that actually aren't true. And so there's this reaction from secular people who are saying, actually, a bit hard on Christianity. Like everything in Christianity is not colonialism and all these things that you're making it out to be. What about the rule of law? What about democracy? That's obviously come from the Greeks and Romans as well. But yeah, this whole idea that Tom says that you can't see the West without understanding the Bible and so he has some different views on different aspects of the biblical narrative. They did a really interesting podcast on the Christmas story, for example, which I found that fascinating. It was a whole long-form podcast by those guys on what happened at Christmas. And they had their opinions that I disagreed with on some things, but there's this articulation of it. So the last thing I'd have to say is I'm wondering, is it a Bob Dylan moment or is it a Jesus Christ Superstar movement? Because the last thing I'd say is if you go further back to Bob Dylan, there was this stage play which has just been released again recently. Tim's actually told me it's his favourite stage play, what do you call it, musical. Yeah. And it's a non-Christian take on Jesus and Jesus Christ Superstar. It was very controversial at the time because a lot of Christians panned it and a lot of church leaders came out and called it, blasphemy and all sorts of things. But it just created this moment in the zeitgeist where people were talking about Jesus and actually dressing like Jesus, because it was all these hippies with long hair and beards, and it became this cultural phenomenon that I think the Jesus movement kind of in some ways rode that wave of that moment in cultural change, where there was this fascination for a couple of minutes about Jesus again. And it was almost like everyone was looking for love, and then all these Christian hippies started saying, yeah, you're looking for love, but you're looking in the wrong direction. Jesus is the one. And I remember John Stott released he released a commentary on, I think it was John's Gospel or Luke. It'll come to me after I record, I'm sure, but someone could check it. But anyway, in the introduction to that commentary he wrote this little explanation that for him the Jesus movement was really interesting because the Jesus of Jesus Christ Superstar was kind of people looking for the right thing in the wrong places. But if you do understand that Jesus is God, and so there's this whole stuff that Christians were bouncing off. So in summary, it gets me to wonder, I've quite strongly agreed with Crouch in the past about, does commentary on culture actually make any difference? We're just Christians talking about it. But all of a sudden it seems to be changing political realities and elections, these long-form cultural critiques. So I'm finding that really interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, because you always think that, has there been a space to be able to do that in previous times? And perhaps there hasn't. I mean, I'm not sure. I could be wrong as well, but a way to have, like we're doing right now, an hour-long conversation that people want to listen to and want to be part of, which allows for those things that you're saying. I don't know if there has been ever before, because it would either be newspapers, it'd be TV, it'd have to be more bite-sized. Yeah,
well, people would write something, someone else would write something back to that, whatever was written in magazines and books and stuff. And then I suppose you've got your town hall sort of things where some people would create a forum in a church where they'd get two people to debate, I suppose public debates like that. But I can't think of anything else. Can you, Tim?
Yeah, and I think obviously the written word, so people writing, but that didn't necessarily get to a popular.
Well, they're the pamphlets in the Middle Ages that the reformers used to promulgate their ideas were pretty much similar. I think
print them and send around. I mean, Luther's 99 Theses, was printed up by a mate and sent around all over.
And the printing press had a big influence on that.
Well, that's right. Yeah, so. I mean, the printed word obviously is a huge part of that. Because that's you can disseminate quickly and cheaply, which hadn't been available up until that point.
I suppose popular music disseminated ideas quickly through songs.
But you can't get into someone else's conversation at the time.
That's the thing.
Can you?
The critique bit, it's really cool.
Like you're bouncing the ideas off each other as you go.
I mean, in the past, a political party, if they were going to try and get traction, would have to try and advertise in commercials between things, and maybe there'd be a presidential debate on TV or a prime minister's debate or whatever, but to actually be able to get one of the candidates and sit them down, talk to them for 3 hours, it's very interesting. And of course they're going to be guarded and all that, but the longer they sit and talk, the more you do get a bit of a glimpse into who they are, I suppose.
And how they think and why they might make certain decisions going forward. Interesting, I just found a Reddit thread that there's apparently a born-again Christian trilogy of Bob Dylan albums: Slow Train Coming, Saved, and Shot of Love.
There you go. Yeah, I didn't know that last one.
And to might have to look it up. Answer the previous question of Elon Musk's children's names: Nevada, Griffin and Vivian, Kai, Saxon and Damien, they're triplets. There is the XAX 12 mask. Looks like there's a Roman numerals in there.
Yeah, I think that was the kid that came on stage. Yeah, called
X,
him X for short.
yep. There's Exa, Strider, and Azure. Techno Mechanicus, and Baby X, who is due. Oh no, has been born now. So I don't know the name for that, but yeah,
maybe that was the one. Oh, yeah, I don't know, but yeah, I don't follow that.
Interesting
stuff
child names
too closely. Yeah,
Yeah.
very interesting.
Anyway, we can move on from Elon Musk's child names. We're going to look at practice of ministry teams. And, we talked about there's different types of ministry there. We're talking about Wes Huff, for example, different types of public ministry. There's also other types of ministry that you can do at church, serving in ministry teams. I was editing last week's podcast. I was like, you mentioned, Stu, something about how a large proportion of our community is serving in community groups. Is serving in our community in ministry teams. And what I wanted to ask you was, why is that something that we need to bring up? Because are people not serving in their ministry teams in most churches?
Well, there was an old adage when I was growing up that 20% of the people in a church do 80% of the ministry. And there was a sense that church, when I was growing up, had become more of an event. And there was a lot of focus for a while there on how professional the church service was and how professional the ministries were that we presented. And as I've said previously, I think Soul Revival was in a way a reaction against church as event. Not that we don't have events and that it's okay to have events, but we saw ministry less as being on a roster and trying to be putting on a professional event, obviously serving to the best of our abilities, but to see serving as being part of the body of Christ. And that Ephesians 4 framework that we talked about of pastors raising up ministers for the gospel. So, when I was young, we used to call our pastor a minister, and the sense was he would do all the ministry and we'd go to church, and I suppose a few people would help him to put that on. But when you think about Romans 12, as we were doing earlier, Romans 12 also talks about the fact, like Ephesians 4 does, that the Christian church is a body, and that we're all given gifts by the Holy Spirit to use to build up the body of Christ, with Christ as the head of the body. And so when you think of it like that, it makes sense to us to try and create spaces for people to serve in, where there's a flexibility, I suppose, to have a fairly broad range of different opportunities to give Christians opportunities to serve. So that serving is part of being Christian. It's not a duty, it's a joy. It's sure, sometimes it's hard work and sometimes it gets a bit overwhelming. So we also say, if you get into a ministry where you're feeling a bit overwhelmed, we have a thing called ministry slide, where we say you can slide out of that role because you're more important than the actual ministry you do. So we're not only interested in you because you are the one who plays guitar on Sunday morning or does photocopying during the week or something, but we're actually brothers and sisters, and we're a family. And so let's be a family, and you can slide back into it again later if you can, or you might be doing youth leadership until you have kids and keep doing youth leadership. But someone might keep doing leadership when they're having kids. Another person might slide into a different ministry after they have kids. So I kept doing youth ministry after we had kids, and Lou slid into parish council. She started ministering in that area. And so, yes, I think coming at it too from the relational side of it, that we're in relationship with Jesus, and so we're also in relationship with each other. And so when we serve together, we're more than just a team. We're actually friends for the gospel. And where some friendship teams might go to the movies together or do some kind of activity that they all like doing together, some special interest, as Christians, we serve Jesus together and we build up the church together, and that's our special interest. Yeah. So we serve together, and by serving together, I think that grows intimacy amongst Christians as well. So I think, I like to think of Christians serving in the church, that there can be a formal ministry or an informal ministry. Not everything is formal. And not everyone at our church has a formal ministry, but by creating some formal ministry, people can conceptualise a little bit better how they could get involved. When I was growing up, there was this big focus on what's your spiritual gift so that you can serve. Mm-hmm. But it was a bit individualistic because it was almost like you had to work out through doing a little questionnaire, for example. I did a questionnaire once someone gave me in youth group to find out what my spiritual gifts were. I was like, do you like telling people about Jesus? Do you like talking? Do you like, and then, your spiritual gift could be blah, blah, blah. And I remember at the time thinking, I don't know if that's the point of it. Like the point of the spiritual gifts is you just serve and you kind of work it out as you do it.
Yeah.
And if you can't do something, then you can slide into something else, sort of thing. So,
what was your result? Do you remember?
Oh gosh,
it'd be really interesting to see how accurate it was.
I think I was an evangelist. I think that's what it was. So ironically, that's sort of turned out to be kind of true. But yeah, there were questions like, have you ever led someone to Christ? Do you tell people about Jesus? There was stuff like that in it. But the other funny thing I found is that, not many people in my youth group said, hey, guess what my gift is, everyone? The gift of helps.
Cleaning toilets.
Cleaning toilets. Or it was all
administration.
Yeah. Anyway.
And does that affect having that kind of perspective on spiritual gifts? That kind of makes people think, I don't have any of these, so I shouldn't serve?
It does, and it also says, I just do this, I don't do that. And even at our church, like I was sitting there the other day, and I think I might have said this before, it's because it's still happening. My 80-year-old mother walks past the bin and it was full, so she just gets the rubbish and picks the bin out. Well, there's about 100 people sitting there watching her do it, having chats and talking, probably thinking, that's Bev's spiritual gift, or that's Bev's ministry, or that's what Bev does because she's in charge of hospitality.
Yeah.
And there's people who are up singing in front of church, I don't clean the bin out. Anyway, I just walked over and said, Mum, give me the bin, I'll do that, And then it reminded me again, I've got to make sure I get to that bin before Bev does, actually. So I think there's something there that we need to discuss as a church, talking not just at Soul Revival, but right across our churches about, is someone up the front willing to clean the toilets? There's that old story about, what was it, the after the communist revolution, the USSR. There's, I think it's a myth, but this story that the communists come to this village and they say, we've come to take ownership of the village, because there was a little while there after the revolution where people just ran the farms and started working together on the local area, probably what the government wanted, but then the socialist idea was to come centralise all that. Anyway, so they came in and they come to this village and they say, who's your leader? And they said, I think he's down the road. And they go down the road, where's the leader? He's in that house. They go into the house, where's your leader? He's cleaning the toilets. And then the communists couldn't believe that the leader would be cleaning the toilets, even though they're communists. And yeah, sure enough, he's in there with, cleaning the toilets. And I sort of think, I don't know if it's true, probably isn't, but it's a nice story. Because it sort of says to me that, because it was about a Christian leader who was being a Christian, So yeah, just to, sometimes we set up a big goal of let's run church really well, and then a lot of the choices we make after that kind of cascade down.
Yeah.
But if we start off thinking we're a body of Christ and thinking how do we express that, sometimes you end up at different places.
I love how, Stu, you touched on the thing of that serving together is actually can be a real joy and real intimacy, create a real intimacy amongst you as a friendship group. Yep. Do you want to speak to that a bit more, Tim, like your experience and stuff? Because I could definitely say that that's the truth for me in terms of leading youth. For example, there was 2 guys that we started leading with. I was leading with my friend Michael, and we're like, yeah, we're going to go lead. We went to school together. We'd been friends for quite a long time. And then we were told, Jared and Pete will be leading with you. And we're like, who is that? And now they're 2 of our, we have really good, strong relationships with those guys because we led for them for so long and served with them. So that's my story, I suppose. Do you have anything like that? That there is a real joy, I think, and the more you serve, the more joy you feel. So therefore you serve more.
Can I ask you a question just before Tim jumps in? Yeah. Did you have any of those guys in your bridal party or vice versa?
I did not, no.
Have you seen any of those guys being in each other's bridal parties out of their leadership?
Yeah. So Michael was in Jared's. because they led the youth when we started youth at Soul Revival as well. Yeah. So they'd been ministering together for even longer.
I see that time and time again in youth ministry, and I'm sure other churches do, that people become such good friends, they didn't even know each other before they started leading. But yeah, you can actually, when you're good friends with Jesus, and you become best friends for the gospel. That's a really cool dynamic when that happens.
Yeah, definitely.
Sorry, Tim.
No, that's all right. I was thinking about your marriage question. Yeah, 2 of my groomsmen were youth leaders alongside me, so we were youth leading together every week.
Did you have any youth in your bridal party as well?
I didn't have any youth in the bridal party. We did have some kids come. So the Fox kids, who were like 1, 2 and 3 at the time, they were at our wedding. So I remember I was have some photos.
Because you're also more involved with kids ministry.
We were in kids ministry, yeah, a lot more than youth ministry. And so, yes, we had the kids coming along, which was really fun. Yeah. But yes, in terms of friendship, yeah, I mean, I think the amount of time that we spend together, and I think there's a connection there between the leading together, but then also the way we were doing ministry at Gaimea, of leading together on Friday nights and Sunday mornings for kids, and then spending Saturday nights together meant that you were really good friends. And that, I think it was that Saturday night, potentially even more so than actually leading together on Friday, that solidified that this was a friendship, not just a task. Because on a Friday night, I mean, there's set up and there's pack down and there's some mucking around, there's some debrief, and there's joviality that happens in the midst of doing ministry alongside each other. But if that's all that there was, then it would still, you wouldn't get to that next level of friendship, I don't think. So the fact that we were hanging out for a long time together relationally without a task to do on Saturday night actually solidified the friendships that then reinforced the way we were doing ministry together. And so I think about my children's ministry team at Gaimea as well. There's a particular stage of life where none of us had kids and we're all a lot more available. But we would spend, set up time before church through to, or sometimes all the way through the whole day until we all go to church together at night. So we would be spending 12, 13 hours together. And again, because, we had the time, but it was also natural to just continue hanging out after ministering together, after debriefing. All right, well, what are we going to do? We're all friends. Like, you got anything on? No, I'll come back to my place. That's so good. Do this, whatever it was. So, yes, lots of really strong friendships were formed there. And we also did Bible study together on Tuesday nights together. Most of us were on Saturday nights together. So yeah, I think the way in which friendship and service were interrelated, I think is the key there, which makes the service and the ministry team more of that friendship stuff that we talked about last time, which is it's not just professionals and professionalised doing a task together, but it's actually just friends engaging together. And doing that ministry really, really well, which I think is really a lovely way to do it. And it creates that levelling effect as well, that we're all kind of engaged in ministry. And I think doing ministry teams as friendship also, while you want to do it well, it takes away some of that expectation that this is going to be expertly done all the time. You want to do it well, and obviously there's standards we want to maintain, but because it's relational, again, we talked last time about like a family meal. A family meal is not professional. A family meal is relational. And so if someone brings a packet of chips because that's all they had capacity to contribute, no one cares. Like, you've contributed. Like, it's just great that you're here and that you've shared in some way. If someone in their outside of this family meal, if they're in their life, their vocation, their career is a chef, and therefore they bring a expertly created meal to the same meal that someone else brought a packet of Tim Tams or a packet of chips, people aren't there going, oh, well, you've overshot yourself and like you've really failed here when you contributed to this meal together. It's like, no, like everyone appreciates everything that you bring. And so I think that relational nature to ministry teams makes a difference as well.
Yeah, no, I definitely think that's true. I thought it'd be worth also looking at now I suppose we talk about the practice, like what we actually do as we call them service teams here at Soar Revival. We have 10 of them, and we can talk in more depth about them later. But Stu, you mentioned last episode that it's important to help people feel something part of something bigger than themselves. So I think that I was going to ask you, how do you create that? Because in essence, there's no real biblical imperative of what you should do as service teams or ministry teams in a church. So how do you kind of view that, in a sense that we still want to stick to obviously biblical principles, right?
Yeah. So we've been talking about a very organic model of organising ministry teams. It comes from, again, just coming back to Romans 12. If the gospel is our why, from Romans 12 verses 1 to 2, and we are to be living sacrifices, holy, pleasing God. How do we express that? Well, it's in the body of Christ. So the strategy, I suppose, is to be part of the church and partner with Jesus as he builds the church. And so then in verse 12 it goes on and talks more about the practice of that, and talks about love being sincere as the beginning of that section. And there's some really cool things to bring out of that. So our paradigm kind of flows as, hey, instead of saying to someone, would you like to be a part of a service team to help us to run the event on Sunday? It's, would you like to be friends with us? And the way we express friendship, we do friendship by being part of a ministry team, because that's an expression that flows out of the gospel being expressed in a community. And our expression then is to have sincere love for God and sincere love for one another, and sincere love for people who are not in the church too. So I think if you have a more business acumen and you look at service teams and the way you organise ministry from an efficiency point of view, you come to kind of a different culture a little bit, I think. I'm not saying it's wrong or bad, it's just different. So a lot of people who come to our church expect us to have a bit more of a business acumen when we come to talk about how we run things from an efficiency point of view, because I think sometimes elders or parish councils are a bit like board of directors, and the minister can sometimes come across a bit like the CEO, very professional, and we've got all these things, we're doing a really professional job. I often hear business people say to me, the church, if the church was run a bit more professionally, you hear those kind of things sometimes. So some people have leaned into that and looking for efficiency, but we feel like that's an industrialisation of our relationships to only think of efficiency. So there's an aspect to it that's really helpful, because we want to make sure we're not burning people out and we're not having 16 people doing the same thing, or we're not working cross purposes. So it's good to be organised, and we like to be organised. But our basis is we're relational. And so rather than being a board of directors, our leadership team in our parish council and then all the ministry coordinators is a big friendship group. So in our meetings we'll have a bit of fun, and some people who come don't understand that, because it's like, this is a lot of waste of time. I don't think I'll come back to this because I'm a very busy person. But we're like, no, well, we're doing this as mates. So that is very different, and not many churches, I don't think, come at that sort of practical application of ministry that way. But what we then do is go, all right, well, if we're going to have pastors who are building up people for ministry, what if we have some teams that we form that broadly cover most of the ministries we do at church? Now, there are models that are generalist models where there's a pastor who's a generalist, and that model is that pastor then runs a church and does lots of things. And sometimes that can be an inhibitor for growth, because the pastor can become a bit of a bottleneck. There's some other models where people take, say, 5 ministry areas and allocate those to 5 different pastors, and then those pastors, rather than being generalist pastors, are generally looking after something like, in the 5M models, I think it's called magnification worship. People use different words for that, but that's quite a popular model for organising church teams. And so that's another option. Some people have a mix between generalist and specific ministries. And so that's another way forward. I think the idea of having a pastor, though, who's looking after one area broadly goes back to the book called Purpose-Driven Life, I think.
Purpose-Driven Church.
Purpose-Driven Church, thank you for correcting me. Purpose-Driven Church by Rick Warren.
Yes.
So you could maybe speak to that a bit more. But yeah, some people, and that's got a theological basis to it as well. But that model is to say, instead of having a generalist pastor who's looking after a gathering of God's people, all the gatherings' music is looked after by the worship pastor or the magnification pastor. So there's different ways people cut this. I think generally that model comes from the business world, where there's this idea to have a bit more efficiency, so that there's not, if you've got 3 services, there's not 3 different music teams with 3 different pastors trying to all do the same thing. There's one person who's looking after all of that, and there's a lot of good reasons to do that. There's also in the business world later on, a later theory is this idea of having both generalist and specific task focus, because one of the difficulties of the generalist could become a bit inefficient. But if I understand it correctly, and some people might want to correct me if I'm wrong, because I'm not casting shade on any of these approaches, I'm just saying they're ones I've seen, because it's great, whatever works for churches, but one of the things I've wondered about is we've also got to be careful we don't silo our ministries, and they've all got to work together as well. So later business acumen has come out that maybe having a mix of generalist and specific task focuses might be helpful. So in our church, ever since we were a youth group, actually back in the 90s, we've always had a generalist youth pastor who's looking after a gathering of God's people, and then have volunteer areas where the volunteers can look after a specific ministry area in light of Ephesians 4. So instead of having 5 teams in our church, we have 10. And the reason we have 10 is because we think that a volunteer person might not be able to look after such a really big group if we only categorise all the ministries of the church into 5. But look, you can cut and dice it lots of different ways. We have problems with our model as well, including things like, well, that's a lot of service teams to have to set up, for example. That means we do have to have some committed volunteers who are happy to oversee and coordinate those areas. So there's no such thing as a perfect model. But in our group model, the idea is that the pastor's looking after a gathering and also has a service team hat, so that they're also encouraging the volunteers for a particular service team area. So Joel, you're looking after the communication service team as a pastor, but you also have a central coordinator who's working with you ideally. Tim is the same in kids ministry, and ideally we sometimes have gaps in this system, as I said before, and that's the problem with the system. But ideally we'll have a kids central coordinator as well. And so that means it gives the community lots of opportunity to serve. From the top down, it's not this only the clergy are working in leadership. It also gives lots of opportunity for men and women to work in team together right across the church. So within our context, we not only have elected representatives, as many different denominations have, like with parish councils or elders and all sorts of different models, but we attach an idea called the Soul Revival Council to our parish council, and it could be attached to different denominational models as well. But what we do is we get the ministry leaders, the coordinators we call them, and the pastors and the parish council, which deals with our money, to all meet together in what's called the Soul Revival Council. And then the parish council can meet separately to make decisions financially off the back of being able to talk to everybody, and we get a lot of stuff done a lot quicker. And it also raises people up that there's less distinction between the clergy and the rest of the community, so that we're all serving together. That's a long answer to your question, but I think that's not a bad way to kind of envisage what we're doing, because I think our listeners and viewers need to think, what's our paradigm that we want to create? Like, are we coming out of a 5Ms kind of model, or a generalist model, or this kind of hybrid that other churches do as well as us? It's not just us that does a hybrid, but yeah, doing generalist and specific at the same time. And then there's this sense of, are we trying to do this professionally as a group of really onto it leaders who are like really professional, or are we a group of friends who are having fun doing this ministry together. It's a really different matter. And if people think, well, where does the friendship come from the Bible? Keep remembering John 15:15, where Jesus says to the first church, the disciples, I no longer call you servants, I call you friends. So in my mind, service is not a duty. Well, it is a duty and a calling, but it's also a joy and a lifestyle that we live as friends with Jesus. And this is what we do when we hang out. We build the church. So, yeah, that's...
Can I get your thoughts on that, Tim, in terms of the generalist and specific ministry? Is there something that you've seen different that has kind of challenged the way that we kind of do church?
Having my previous role as children's advisor for YouthWorks, so you got to see a lot of different churches and the way they do things, and a lot of churches were appointing roles and employing staff based on some of these portfolio type roles. And one of the things I noticed there was, I think there is a certain efficiency that comes across when you have someone who's looking across, the magnification or, the music, the arts, the worship kind of stuff right across, and got their fingers in all of those, and thinking about how does that work well across the entire number of gatherings or ministries or whatever. One of the things that I saw sometimes was it wasn't always clear where youth and children's ministry fit into those portfolios, because they don't explicitly articulate youth or kids ministry. They don't articulate any age or stage-based ministry. They don't speculate about seniors ministry either, or men's breakfasts or women's breakfasts, or those kinds of things. And so it was trying to work out how do you integrate some of those portfolio roles into other types of ministries outside of the Sunday gatherings. I think they seem to work well sometimes when you have they look at a gathering level, but beyond that it was always a little bit unclear how that was working out in practice. One of the things I think has been really benefit to the way that we've tried to do our service teams and raise up a number of volunteer ministry people is, again, just this honouring that everyone is involved in helping the church run. Like, we want to be a family, we want to all be contributing to each other. We're a group of friends, and therefore we're all doing this together. And going back to our very first part of this podcast, talking about Wes Huff and the idea that sometimes there are people who have vocational ministry roles. Like, that is their actual job to be out in there. But most of our church do not have vocational ministry roles. Their vocations are they're bakers and shopkeepers and bus drivers and lawyers and teachers and nurses, and they have all of these things that are out there. And one of the things I love about Luther and the Reformation was that he honoured all of those roles and said, if you're a baker, bake bread to the best of your ability, because that honours God in that role. So we want to be honouring the things that people do outside of church. And when they come in and gather together, we're not getting them to do another task, another role. That's fine that you're a school teacher, but actually when you're in church, the only thing we really care about is whether you can flip bacon or not. It's like, well, no, come in and as friends, let's flip some bacon together, because we want this to this church and our life together to flow well together. And so sometimes it's hard to communicate that to people, because we say, hey, as friends, let's serve our kids, let's raise our kids together to be disciples of Jesus. And they say, oh, so you want me on the kid roster? No, I want you to engage relationally with 5-year-olds and help them to know that this church is for them and for you, and you might, express your brother and sisterhood and friendship with them because of Christ together. It's not quite as catchy as sit on a roster and babysit the kids once a month, but it's harder to communicate, and particularly for those who have come from other places where it was about efficiency and filling rosters and doing tasks. And so there are things that we want to do. There is, things to teach or games to play or craft to make or whatever it is. But to try and recapture that in a sense of, hey, as friends, we're raising our youngest friends to be disciples together in Jesus. It's difficult to communicate, but I think it's worth keep pushing forward and pursuing.
Yeah, I think that's a really worthwhile way to think about it, because I was just listening to what you were saying there, both of you actually, and I was going to say, do you think that people hear 10 service teams and just go, what?
Oh, yeah, 100%. Yeah, and people hear all this stuff about friendship and go, oh, just offering to help with the
I don't want to be
kids
friends.
ministry. Like, why do I have to be friends? There's actually a really funny video I saw. It might have been a Saturday Night Live. What's that? SNL? Is that Saturday night?
Night Live,
Yeah.
It might have been one of those because I think I recognised one of the actors in it. But it was like this clip that went, I think the start was, here's one of the Christian Bible studies you can join or something. Let's meet the group. It was like a parody on a Christian video that you might show in church, and there's all these really awkward people going, hi, my name's George. Oh, hi, I'm Sarah. And the implication was as if you'd want to join that, like that. And I think that was like, I don't know, I'm still thinking about that clip because I think sometimes we come in with a really high view of relationship in church, and I wonder if sometimes people go, well, that's all well and good, but I don't want to necessarily become friends with George or Sarah. There's this sense that like, I'll come in and do that, but don't ask me to be friends with them.
Well, that's the flip side, isn't it?
gift.
Like sometimes, we trying to raise a high view of saying it's not just being on a roster; it's being friends with kids or being friends together. Putting the meal together or leading the church in the music ministry, and for some people actually just want to be on a roster. They're just like,
that's right.
Can you just put me down for once a month, and because that's my capacity, and trying to raise that vision of saying, no, it's not just a roster. It's a friendship group. It's a community of people who are being friends together in order to love one another. And they're like, that's just a lot of effort.
Which is a ministry to you, to support you as you support them, which people don't get either, because often they're just asked to do a ministry and then no one's really discipling him in that ministry. And so and that's why sometimes people burn out, I think, because not just because they're doing too much, but they actually don't get support. So when we first started Soul Revival, and I had a lovely young woman who, I was a young man myself and Lou was a young woman, and anyway, another young woman said, I'll run the one of the youth groups, and we're like, yeah, that'd be great, thank you. And fantastic, went on to do great ministry, fantastic person. But she said, as long as you don't ask me to go to that Saturday night group, I don't have time. And it wasn't that she was against it. She just said, I don't have time to do Friday night and Saturday night. And I'm like, okay, yeah, cool. And in the early days, like I was already playing around with the idea of, wouldn't it be cool if we were friends with Jesus first on Saturday night as friends, and then we went and led the kids on Friday night as friends, and then the kids could grow up into our friendship group. But then because she didn't want to do it, I wanted it to be an opt-in thing where people didn't have to buy into the whole idea of being friends. And 6 months later, she said, I don't think I can do this anymore because no one's supporting me. I'm not getting any support. And all I'm doing is turning up at the group and running the group, and it's really hard. And I reflected on that with her because I agreed with her. It was like outside of the structure that we'd set up of being friends on Saturday, there wasn't a support network. Now, some churches solve that by saying, let's have one-on-ones with coordinators, let's have Bible study to look after someone, all sorts of different ideas. And ours is a fairly high commitment version of discipleship, which is let's spend time on Saturday night socially as well as around God's Word on Saturday night as mates, like hanging out, which is a high view of friendship and between Christian people serving in a team together. But yeah, I still to this day, if someone says, I don't want to be friends with people, I just want to go on a roster, I'm like, okay, yeah, cool, that's fine. And it actually comes out of our strategy that we talked about from Oldenburg, third place strategy, where Oldenburg says that you're going to have people who are regular in an idea, in a community, who set the culture, and people who are irregular and not necessarily buy into the whole thing. And that's really healthy, as long as there's a permeable membrane between those two groups, that people from irregular can move towards regular and people from regular can move out to irregular. But when it comes to practice of service teams, we say, look, generally, if you would like to work in kids ministry and you don't want to be expressing such a deep reality of friendship, there is a core group of people in the kids ministry that are keen to develop that friendship group within that you can enjoy the fruit of, but you might not want to participate in that. And we do say, yeah, still be a part of us. Now, early on in youth ministry, I used to say when I was at Guyman Anglican, well, if you don't want to buy into the friendship group, maybe there's other ministries at church you could do, because we feel like it's really important for the young people to see that we're not just running a community for them to become friends. We want to be their friends. And so a lot of people, a lot of young adults used to say that's too ministry intensive. And there were people who wanted to do it too. So there was always two kinds of young adults at Glen Anglican, those that wanted to commit to that and those that didn't. But it's interesting that even to this day, that's I suppose, part of our model that is fraught, because sometimes people might not feel as part of things if they're not giving as much of a time commitment to the friendship group idea as the ministry side of it. However, I think we're holding that tension pretty well at the moment, and people are feeling heaps of permission to either buy into that or not. But the fruit we've had from the fact that there are some people in the ministry team that are really keen to be friends, I think is one of the cultural engines of our church that makes it a really enjoyable ministry to be a part of.
Yep. Yeah. No, I think you're right about that. Is it? Yeah, the friendship aspect is probably a big. I mean, it had a huge impact on the development of my faith and wanting to become a Christian, because I could see other people hanging out as friends, and I'm like, well, what is the appeal? Why are they being friends together? Therefore, I said, I've got to be part of this. I think that's really where I got to. Yeah. So let's break it down to be like really a little bit more functional. We've got 10 service teams. See if I can name them all. Arts, communications, I've written them down so I can remember them. Hospitality, life support, community groups, or missional communities, we call them sometimes. Welcoming, World, Kids, Youth, and Berea, which is our internal training program, that Berea, the last one.
And life support's our pastoral care.
Yeah, life support is our pastoral care. So you mentioned coordinators before, though. Why don't I give? Do you want to, Tim, have a go at explaining what the idea is behind the coordinators? Because we have pastors overseeing the service teams, but we have volunteers running the service teams, and that's mainly to begin with coordinators. Do you want to explain the coordinator model that we have under our service teams?
Yeah. So each of the ministry teams, as you said, has a pastor, who is a staff member of the church looking after it. And so that way we can make sure that there is someone who is vocationally engaged with the church to be looking after each of these. But that doesn't mean that they have to be doing the majority of the ministry. And we want to honour our volunteers and raise them up. And we also want to free up the pastors to be able to do the things that only pastors can do during the week as well. So there are particular things that are appropriate for vocational pastors to be doing. And there's plenty of things that the volunteer people can be a part of. So for each of our ministry areas, like you talked about, there's a coordinator for the gathering. So each gathering. So each of our 7 gatherings will have each of those 10 service teams represented there, and there will be a coordinator for each of those service teams at each gathering. So that's the gathering service coordinator. And ideally this is a volunteer person. Again, these are not all filled, like we have holes in the ministry, and that's okay. We're working this live as we go. But the idea is that each of those would be filled by someone in that gathering. And that way that there's someone who knows that gathering really well, because that is their home gathering. That's where they get their weekly church is there in that space. And so they're also leading and making sure that service team happens. So arts is a really easy example to think about. So Braden is our arts pastor, and so he has pastoral oversight over all the things that happen in arts. When we say arts, we're thinking about the music teams, the Bible reading and prayer teams. We're thinking about the behind the scenes, things like the sound and the PowerPoint Proclaim software, all those kinds of things all comes in under the arts team. And so each gathering has those elements in it. And so Braden has pastoral oversight over all those 7 gatherings. And so his responsibility is to meet with each of his 7 coordinators and see what does that coordinator need. That coordinator will need different things depending on the different size of the gathering. So the gatherings that have a much larger membership or people go into it will have more options potentially for musicians or for sound people or whatever it is, Bible readers. And so there'll be more people to draw from. He'll be organising those bands together, but it means that Braden doesn't have to be present at each of those 7. Which again, with the structure of some of our services, you can't physically be present at all 7 over the weekend, because we have 2 running parallel on Saturday night. We have 3 running parallel on Sunday morning. So you can't physically be at every gathering. And so having the coordinator there who is actually running on the ground ministry for each of those service teams is really key. And so, we have those levels down. So pastors responsible on top, they have their gathering coordinator at each of the gatherings, looking sure that they are running the ministry well. The way that this communication happens really well, obviously, ad hoc communication can happen anytime, but when we meet together once a term for a parish council meeting, so an all-in meeting, all of those gathering coordinators from each service team all come together. So if you've got 7 gatherings, 10 service teams at each one, that's potentially 70 people, plus the paid vocational pastoral staff, plus the elected representatives. So if they were all actual individuals, and again, there are holes and there are people doubling up, but if that was all, you'd have a full council of close to 100 people, really, actually, to have them all there. And the way we split that time is really important. So we do some things all together, and then we break up into the gatherings. So everyone from a Saturday night will all come together, from Kirrawee will all come together, and each of the gathering coordinators gets to say, hey, speaking on behalf of arts, these are the things we're noticing that's going well, these are the things we're struggling with. Speaking on behalf of kids, this is the things we're noticing. Speaking on behalf of hospitality, etc. You go around and everyone gets to share a little bit. And that way, everyone who is a key coordinator of a service team at Saturday night gets to meet together at least once a term and say, hey, what are we noticing as we try all together to pull this service off? Where are the holes? Who's got too many people? Who doesn't have enough people? How do we feel that people are being welcomed, engaged? Hey, this person's been coming to our church for 18 months now. Have they been engaged in ministry?
Cultural issues.
Cultural issues that come up. Yeah, we've noticed that actually we've lost some of our welcoming further, and there's not enough people welcoming. And it's not just the welcoming team that's responsible for that. We want there to be a whole culture of people who are noticing new people or noticing lonely people, or going out of your way to sit with people you wouldn't normally sit with. How do we change that altogether as a culture? So you have those kind of conversations, and then we spend the last third of our night back in the service teams. And now Braden gets together with all of his arts coordinators, and they can have the same conversation but reverse. Speaking on behalf of Ride, here's what I'm noticing in arts ministry. Speaking on behalf of Cronulla, here's what I'm noticing in arts ministry. Oh, right, how do we resource each other? How do we help each other? What are some of the cultural things about arts ministry? What do we notice about the way that sometimes the sound desk is left in this configuration on Saturday night, which means that the Sunday morning people find it really difficult to work out how to reset it again? Oh yeah, we can fix that up. Let's talk about that. Yeah. So you end up with this matrix. If you can imagine like a Excel table of the gatherings and the service teams, and if each one of those boxes is filled, you've actually got a huge proportion of volunteers who are all together helping run the ministry of the church. And they've had these conversations in the presence of the vocational pastors, the elected representatives who are making decisions about space and money, property, and all of that, it just helps it to hum along really well. Now, again, the way I've painted that is kind of an ideal. And again, we're still growing. There are holes, there are coordinators not in places, there are people doubling up, there are people we need to raise up into ministry. But that's what we're heading towards. And we have found that doing that, spending time together, just makes a huge difference in being able to run the church in really helpful ways. And I think we've said this previously on different episodes, but because we've put relationship first and we're trying to do this as friends, that ends up with a particular type of efficiency, which wasn't what we were aiming for, but ends up being a really lovely byproduct, that we do actually solve problems relatively quickly. We actually do get answers to solutions relatively quickly. And that wasn't our starting point. It wasn't priority A, but it ends up happening anyway, which we found really lovely as well.
And I think as well, as you explained that really well, it helps mitigate against the thing you said earlier. The ministry is becoming silos. That's the important part too, isn't it? Is that we're working together as a church together, across our gatherings, but then also within our service teams across all those 7 gatherings, like you said.
And the other thing I think it might be worth saying is we tend to see a pastor overseeing 2 service teams with 2 central coordinators. So ministry teams actually work in pairs. We call them ministry pairs. And it's also an expansion model. So some of our listeners and viewers might be thinking, how do you get to that over time? Like, how did we grow from? Well, we started with 4 people at Soul Revival, Matt, Lauren, me and Lou. And then we grew to 30. And even though it felt at the time like it was a little bit over-engineered, we started experimenting with how many service teams do we need. And over a year or 2, we kind of settled on the 10. But what we sort of started with was trying to think through, let's try and cover all those areas, but let's also think of them as ministry pairs. So when you think of it like that, you only need 5 coordinators to start off with. And then as the team grows, you can double the coordinators and you can grow the ministry. So that's why we talk about ministry capacity. When you're 4, we call that a Vespa. So there's only 4 people. But if they're aspirationally trying to plan a church, by the time they get to 30 people, that Vespa can turn into a Beetle, which is like your first car. And then as that grows to a family of over 100, then that becomes a combi. So a service with all the bells and whistles and the 10 service teams is for the combi, but in the Vespa and the Beetle phase, the Vespa is you probably don't have any service teams, just 4 people. And then in the Beetle phase, you have probably 5 service teams, 5 ministry pairs, and then when you get to the combi stage, then you have your 10. So we've kind of mapped it out so it's a progressive movement for churches not to feel like they have to start with 10 from the very beginning.
Yeah.
So one of our Vespers at Yarrawarra doesn't have 30 people yet, so they don't have music. But that's okay, because in the Vesper form we're saying as long as we're preaching the Word of God and we're praying and we're reading the Bible, the music can come later. So that's kind of how we see that service team structure helping us to think through steps in our growth into the future.
It's interesting that we were talking about how we want to be careful of not being too professional because it creates certain outcomes. But almost talking about that, there is an element of professionalism behind that. But I think we make an effort to kind of not make that front and center. That we know there is a common structure, but it's not because we're prioritizing friendship over doing that.
Yeah, I sort of see it both end. So I think it's like friendship and we're organised because we have meetings, we have calendars, we have all sorts of pathways and strategies and stuff. But at the same time, we're trying to create culture that's not like a business because we don't think that people want to turn up to work again on the weekend when they come to church.
Good way
so
of putting it.
They've already been at work all day. Why do they want to come to a meeting that's like work? But in our mindset, we think like that. We think, well, as long as it doesn't take up too much time and it's efficient, I'll go to it and invest in it.
Yeah, okay. Final question for both of you guys. I think you both contribute to this. Tim, just before we started recording, you said that there are kind of things that we've adapted to as well, being part of the Anglican tradition. And there's words like parish council and things like that. And we also said that just before that it can be a bit daunting to say, if we said to someone, it's like, oh yeah, we want to start with 10 service teams, they'd be like, oh my gosh, that's a lot. If someone was interested though, and thinking about it, like it doesn't have to be an Anglican church that's interested in it, right? It's just more like this can be used in any way. Did you want to say more on that?
Yeah, I just think, we are an Anglican church, and so there are going to be certain structures that are actually given to us by our tradition. So by being an Anglican parish, we actually are required to have a parish council, to have wardens who are given ultimate responsibility for WHS, property, finances, and we can choose to, and every year have, elected representatives to support the wardens. And I think it's in the Anglican rule book that you pick a parish council of 3, 6 or 9. And so we have regularly chosen to have a parish council of 3, and I think there's a freedom there for Stu to appoint others or something like that to it. So there is a certain structure that's given to us, like an oversight structure, and we want to work with that. And so we don't want to ditch that. Like, there are really great things and safeguards in that system which work well. And so we've built around that this structure of pastors, service teams, coordinators, those kinds of things. And there's a freedom there as well to do that. It works well within the Anglican system, but there's nothing necessarily Anglican about the way that we choose to run our council together. And so if you're in a Presbyterian church with an elder board, if you're in Baptist ministries or any other sort of church polity that has every church polity has some way of saying these are the people that we're going to give extra responsibility to, whether it's usually elected, sometimes elected for life. There's all sorts of different ways that church polity can do it. But we're building around that. There's a creativity there to say, hey, this is how we're going to run our ministry teams. And as Stu said as well, it is scalable. Like, these 10 things are things that a church of 30 people are going to be thinking about. You're going to be thinking, how do I welcome someone into, if someone walked through the door, how would you welcome them? If we're going to do some sort of hospitality together, whether it's morning tea or a meal, someone's thinking about that. We've just given it a name. We've called it hospitality. If you're a church and you are choosing to sing, have a worship music ministry, then someone is thinking about the guitars and the songs and who's going to sing and whether you need microphones or not. So it works for a group of 30 people who are thinking about how to do this. In some ways, it kind of works for a Bible study of 12 people. If you've got a house church, you're still thinking about some of these things. If you've got a house church of 12 people and someone has a baby, okay, you've got kids ministry, however that's defined. Someone is thinking about the way in which this child is integrated into this gathering. So, and as we've seen it grow now to a church of something like 800 members, it still continues to grow. You need more people. You need coordinators get a bit more responsibility, but there's layers of leadership under that. So it kind of works both ways. And so it can sound large, but I've actually sat down with a number of people and a number of different churches and sort of drawn this out. And after I've drawn it out, and particularly the way we talk about the meetings that we have regularly and the intersection of gatherings and service teams meeting together and talking things through, the overwhelming response that I get from people is, it looks like it works so well. And it's often coming from people who are frustrated that they don't get a voice in other spaces. So often it's, again, because of my job, I'm often talking with children's ministry leaders, but not always, but the kids ministry is frustrated. They never get a voice to parish council, or, they get to come and report once and parish council go, thanks to meet you. What was your name again? Oh, that's right. Thanks. Yeah. Thanks for looking after our children's ministry. And they never they're feeling isolated onto the side, or it might be the morning tea people who the only outlet they have is to grumble and complain because no one's really getting them an opportunity to express where they're struggling, that they need more cups, but parish council doesn't give them. I guess I would buy myself. Or actually, the way we run it is meant to facilitate lots of conversation and lots of really good collaboration with each other based on a foundation of theological friendship. And so I think that ease. And so, I think that would what I would say is that it works well with Anglican systems. It would work well with any other system. And the great thing about it is it gives voice. Everyone gets to speak up into this thing. Everyone is able to participate and contribute in a way that is not often heard, particularly for those who are not elected representatives or staff.
I like that. Stu, do you want to final comments?
That's a great place to end.
It's a really good place to end. Thank you, Tim. Well done for wrapping up here. So good job. If you do have any other questions, send them through to me, joel@shockabsorber.com.au. You can email them or you can chuck it as a YouTube comment on our channel. But with that, we're going to leave it up. We've wrapped up talking about service teams in terms of theology, strategy, practice, and we'll do another one next week, another mini-series. Yet to be decided, though. We'll let you know when you tune in. We'll leave that on that cliffhanger. Thank you, Stu. Thank you, Tim. Really appreciate it. And we'll finish with a one-way.
One way.